All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hayley McGill, and today's webinar is brought to you by the International Institute for Analytics, otherwise known as IIA, alongside Metric Insights. So today's webinar will be hosted by IIA's Bill Franks and Marius Moscovici of Metric Insights. They will also be joined by John Deere's Michael Bruchhaus. So to give you a little bit of background on IIA, we are the industry's leading source of expertise for companies making the transition to data-driven decision-making and advanced analytics. We offer 4 unbiased, client-oriented services designed to help organizations across the entire analytics life cycle, from ideation through strategy and planning to operationalization. These services that we offer are the Research and Advisory Network, the Analytics Leadership Consortium, analytics maturity assessments, as well as our advisory services. So if you did want to know a little bit more about any of these, you can pop over to our website, which is iianalytics.com/services, and learn a little bit more there. So before we get started, I did just want to cover a few housekeeping items. So we will be accepting questions throughout the presentation. If you just wanted to pop them in the Q&A box, we do have time allocated at the end to get to some of your questions. We would love to hear them. We are also recording this webinar, so if you do have to step out at any point, don't worry, you will have a copy in your inbox tomorrow, which you can watch on demand and share around with your team. So with all of that said, I would like to welcome our speakers. So firstly, like I mentioned, we have Marius Moscovici, who is the CEO and founder at Metric Insights. So Marius has over 20 years of experience in analytics and data warehousing with roles at Oracle, Integral Results, and Linden Lab. So he was a co-founder and CEO of Integral Results, a leading BI consultancy agency that was acquired by IIA Integration. So he also formed and led the analytics group at Linden Lab. Secondly, we have Bill Franks, the Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute for Analytics. So Bill is the author of Taming the Big Tidal Data Wave, The Analytics Revolution, and 97 Things About Ethics Everyone in Data Science Should Know. So his work has spanned clients in a variety of industries for companies ranging in sizes from Fortune 100 companies all the way through to small nonprofit organizations. And finally, Marius and Bill will be joined by Michael Bruchhaus, the Manager of Analytics Consulting at John Deere, who will be sharing a use case with us today. So Michael specializes in agricultural economics, data analytics, and relationship building between the business and analytics. So with all of that said, I am going to hand you over to Bill.
All right, thank you, Hayley. I'm assuming I'm coming through okay now?
You are, we can hear you perfectly.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go for about 10 minutes here and do a little bit of stage setting before I turn it over. And what I want to talk a bit about is this idea of single version of the truth. So, you know, IIA, as we talk to our clients through the services that Hayley mentioned a little bit ago, we get to really get some strong insights into where their problems are and what they're struggling with. And what we consistently hear today still, even though we've had decades of trying to address this problem, are the common things like still struggling just to standardize data and its usage. Large organizations today, that is still a recurring problem. A lot of people that we measure their maturity, we find that they struggle to improve that maturity, no surprise, but it's particularly hard when it comes to data, and that's partly because of the cost of doing so. If you have a lack of leadership, for example, getting some new leaders and some new policies in place can make some pretty swift progress. When it comes to data, you're often looking at pretty substantial investments in systems, technology, and people time. And last, a lot of folks are struggling so much with the basics, they feel that they're really getting behind further on the more advanced stuff. And so all of this is true. One of the solutions that's been discussed for a long time now is a single source of the truth. So what does that look like? The first thing to keep in mind is that it's definitely a noble goal, and it would be great to get to a single source of the truth. The unfortunate reality is that it's never really actually achieved. And the reason is, no matter how much work you do, just think about it. As soon as we have this single source of truth in place, we're going to have a new data source that becomes available internally, or we're going to have a new third-party data source coming our way. We may have changes to the existing data sources. In other words, as soon as we think it's done, it's not really done. And then as soon as we make those changes, there will be other changes. Adding to this is the fact there can be regulatory or policy or business reasons like mergers that necessitate having different versions of the truth by geography or by product or by time frame. And so it's definitely a good idea to pursue this goal, but you have to be realistic that it's more of an ongoing journey than it is a specific one-time project. If you let people mistake that, they could really be disappointed. So one of the most interesting things is there's actually two sides to this problem. And the first one gets the bulk of the attention, which is getting to consistent data. That ties into setting up various databases and data sources, trying to consolidate them, all critically important. But the piece that gets ignored, or if not ignored, not equally weighted certainly, is the consistent usage of that data. And these both have to be in place. In other words, if I have pristine data that's objectively completely clean and consistent and a single source of truth, that won't matter if everybody out in the business community is then using that data in inconsistent ways, interpreting it in inconsistent ways, et cetera. So it's critically important that you not just focus on the technical side of getting the data itself correct, but you similarly have to focus very heavily on the awareness, the training, and the consistency of those end users. You've got to get both of those. It's also important to remember that your end goal isn't really a single version of the truth. That's a means to the end. The end is actually you want the business to be able to make better, more consistent, and more accurate decisions through analytics. The single source of the truth is certainly going to help get you there, but the end game are those better decisions through analytics, not just a successful implementation of one source of the truth. Now, as you go down the path of putting this in place, it's important to understand as well that multiple versions of a metric are absolutely okay if they're documented and understood. And what I mean by this is that there are logical reasons to have multiple different versions of certain metrics. There are times you might need to include or exclude certain types of transactions for reporting purposes. Maybe there's one for regulatory purposes and one for your internal purposes. There's valid reasons to have a 30, a 60, and a 90-day churn flag available for people to look at, depending on the circumstances. And so one of the things I wrote about in my first book, Taming the Big Data Tidal Wave, was something called an enterprise analytic data set, which is sort of the analytics and data science organization's version of a single source of the truth. The idea of that concept, the enterprise analytic data set, was not to get down to one single definition of every possible metric. It was to capture all of the definitions that were in use somewhere, but make sure that while capturing them, they were properly labeled and defined, so that if I went in to do a given analysis, I would know which one to choose. So as you implement multiple versions of metrics, because you need to have them for different reasons, as long as they're governed well, they're labeled well, and then on your reports or dashboards or interfaces, you should have a link as well that a user can go and click and see what is it that I'm actually looking at, then you'll be fine. So we talked about the usage of the data being just as important as the data itself being pristine. And one way to do this is the more you can standardize, obviously, through dashboards and some type of application interface, the user's interaction with it, the better you're able to ensure that there is some consistency. Of course, there's always going to be scenarios where you can't use a standard interface, where you need something custom. The key then, back to what we just talked about, you just simply have to have really good documentation and governance around what's available, how they're defined, when should they be appropriately used. And the typical user should be able to, with a little bit of time, then understand the scope of the data and what makes sense for their purpose. So if you can get the data fairly well standardized and you can get some of these interfaces and dashboards fairly well standardized, you're on a good path towards getting to that single version of the truth. And so you can succeed with this as long as you keep in mind some positives and some negatives that you need to account. On the positive side, in terms of, or I say on the negative side, in terms of common challenges, you'll get a lot of pushback at times about putting the resources necessary to clean up this data and clean up the usage. A lot of people are hesitant to put in their people time, and certainly budgets going towards something that's as non-exciting as cleaning up data. We all know how difficult that can be. You can also have a lot of debates about how to define these metrics and how to standardize them. That's where you're going to have to circle back a little bit to letting people have multiple versions as long as we document them. And part of the drivers for this, and part of the challenge as well, is that different definitions could very well hurt or help specific groups or specific initiatives or specific agendas that people may have. So you want to avoid having to cross those. But of course, all this will fall apart if you don't have the effective governance and some modern analytical tools. You're not going to get it. But as long as you can force those stakeholders to sit down and talk this through, if you can deploy some of the modern tools that are available, including modern BI and governance tools, and if you can monitor the usage of the data just as you monitor the data as it gets created, you can get a pretty good approximation there. So to summarize, three ways we see clients typically handle this. The first is they'll focus 100% on getting the data into a, quote, single source of the truth before they ever allow anyone to access it, before they ever attempt to do anything. This theoretically sounds okay, but what it really leads to is very long timelines, very frustrated business users, very little progress. Others will kind of put their head in the sand and say, you know what? We know it's a problem. We're just going to let the experts who are building any given dashboard, any given statistical model, et cetera, they'll handle it on their end. And in fact, that can work on a case-by-case basis, but as you try and scale that, it falls apart very quickly. You end up with hundreds or thousands of independent processes built at different times. No matter how diligent the creators of those processes were, they're going to get out of date, and the idea of being able to maintain is very difficult. So the third approach, which I think is the one that we'd love to see people take most, is accepting the fact that you're always going to end up with additional repositories, always going to end up with additional definitions. So focus instead on getting it as standardized as you can, and then focus on that documentation and consumption. Make sure you're enabling people to consume it as consistently as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over here to Michael Bruchhaus from Deere. He's going to walk you through some of the work that Deere has been doing in this area. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Let me know if y'all can see my screen.
Yeah, looks good.
All right, thank you. Well, good morning. My name is Michael Bruchhaus. I'm a manager of analytics consulting at John Deere. I'm going to talk us through some use case on going towards a single source of truth. We'll talk about some of the challenges we faced, and then some successes, and then of course some challenges we still face as we make this transition. So first, a little bit about John Deere. You know, John Deere is a world leader in providing advanced products and services, and is committed to the success of those linked to the land. You know, we continue to stick to the qualities of our founder, John Deere, of integrity, quality, commitment, and innovation. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about our group that I work in at John Deere Financial. Our mission that we go by here kind of set the tone for our discussion today. We use public, private, proprietary data to seamlessly deliver value in the form of improved operational performance. So we do a lot of operational data and handle lots of vast amounts of data within John Deere Financial. Incremental equipment sales and finance volume is another one of our goals. So we work with a lot of key stakeholders throughout the business, and also looking for new areas of opportunity that we can provide to the business. So I want to jump into some of the challenges we faced early on as our group was getting going. You know, we had multiple dashboards, spreadsheets, you name it, other applications that were in many locations. We were finding there was a lot of duplication of work between our group and other analytic groups. throughout the organization and even within our own buildings and John Deere Financial. We were, at the time, we only had 2 data catalysts, and we knew that there was a definite demand to expand those catalysts and come up with ways to help us with reporting and working with our stakeholders. And we also found that there was many wranglers within John Deere Financial's walls that were, we would like to say, working on an island. So they were working without the help of data engineers or data scientists or even catalysts, and they were taking requests and saving reports just on their own in their own repositories. So as we started to move towards this single source of truth, a few areas we worked on through some reorganization was we wanted to think of ways that John Deere Financial can become more cohesive within its data sets and reports. And more importantly, how do we get the value that our group can give to our stakeholders and enable the business to make better insights and better decision making? So one area we worked on is we have a data catalyst for every area of our operational business within John Deere Financial. So each one of these catalysts, we refer to it as an area of responsibility, and they own that area. So they work closely with stakeholders, they work closely with our team, and able to bring back those requests from the business all the way back to our team, and we're able to deliver. But having them on that was sort of the premise for us developing and going towards testing out a single source of truth. We've seen practitioners are motivating each other in this way. They are able to work closely. We work very closely with data wranglers, engineers, and scientists, by bringing them from other parts of the building and working within our group. We've seen a lot of training and some organic learning that's happened has been very beneficial and has helped us with working with reports towards a single source. And it also helps to create a better area of our reporting, but also our work task. That we know what everybody's working on at any given time, and our catalysts, they own those projects and keep everybody on task and deliver on time for our stakeholders. So to elaborate a little bit more on some of these processes that we see that are starting to work for us, as we go towards more of an agile mindset within John Deere Financial and John Deere as a whole, and then of course you add on a virtual world we've gone to the last 5 months. If working towards having a single place for reports, a single place for knowing the task of all of our practitioners has been very beneficial in this more faster virtual environment. And so as we move towards a single location for files and reports, as Bill said, it's hard to ever get there completely. And, in our case, in this example, we are moving a certain set of reports to this location. So that we've seen good success, and our stakeholders, they feel empowered. They are able to go find reports on their own, which is something they've never had access to. It's easier for them to find areas of analysis that they may look for and not have to come reach out and look for a project to be built. Reports are already there that they can search and find for. So that's been areas that have been helpful. And also we've seen it create a better culture for data for everyone, and not only for our own practitioners, our catalysts that own those areas, but we've seen our stakeholders, it's a lot better interaction. They can find reports much easier, and we're able to have less duplication of work. So that's been a big success in that area. So, there's always challenges. Bill touched on this earlier, and no matter how close you get to a single source of truth, there's always going to be challenges. And some of the ones we still face are trying to understand what's the right mix of our data engineers to data scientists to data wranglers. As we see transitions within working more in an agile fashion and more virtual, what does that look like? So those are all areas that we're trying to work through and are still challenges for us, but definitely progress we've made in that area. Now, we want to continue to integrate with IT and work closely with data sets. And, we've had a lot of success, as I mentioned, those catalysts owning each one of these areas. That's helped us to work on how we organize our files, by our catalysts. And then, of course, in our single source of truth, how we organize the reports. That's been very helpful. But we also bring that back to our IT teams, and we work lock in step with them on which data and prioritizing data that needs to be migrated to the cloud or in other areas for better use of for our reporting. And so the last part I want to make here is old habits do die hard. Bill's talked about it. You've all faced this, and it's working with our stakeholders. You know, you can imagine, and we all get caught with this. We all have bad habits of, you know, we're so used to working maybe in Excel, so it's difficult to transition to Tableau or to other applications. But also we're used to saving 25, 30 links of a report just on their favorites. But now having a single source of truth for certain areas, training them to just go to that location. And we've seen a lot of progress there, but it's definitely still a challenge. So quickly, I want to talk about our future plans. You know, so we've seen our challenges, we've seen some successes. There's still challenges, but going forward, where do we want to be? So as we think about this visual I have here of, you know, data is everywhere, especially in large corporations, small corporations, data is everywhere. How do you bring that down to our meat grinder example here, and then get those insights out? And then what we feel like is that single source of truth, and will be able to help us enable the business to take off running. And we've already seen really good examples of that, of quicker insights and decision making that's been able to help just, you know, during this COVID pandemic. We've been able to come up with some reporting that has been very beneficial to our leadership by utilizing our single source of truth. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be glad to take questions at the end. Now I'm going to hand it over to Marius.
Thank you, Michael. Let me share my screen. One moment. Let me just get the video going. Okay. Here we go. Okay, hopefully you guys can see my screen. Okay, so thank you, Michael. And so I'm going to talk about basically 4 other use cases, customer use cases, where a single source of truth was a challenge. And, you know, what were those challenges? What were the solutions that these particular customers came up with, and the results that those solutions achieved? So first, we're going to talk about a large retail company that was dealing with some challenges around just lots of information overload and how they dealt with that. We'll be covering a technology software company with some data engagement challenges that they faced and how those were overcome. Then we'll talk about a pharmaceutical company and some very serious data quality issues that they encountered, and the specific things that they did in those areas. And then finally, we'll talk about a clinical trials company that really had to change a lot of things with COVID-19 and really used the analytics as a way to accelerate that change. So the first scenario, the first use case is a company that is very large, a very large retailer. They have 70,000 employees, thousands of reports, and this particular organization, when they surveyed and they looked at their user base and how they were using the analytics, they found that across the multiple BI tools that they had, there were 30 separate portals in the organization. That is, these were WordPress sites, SharePoint sites, custom built web pages, all kinds of different attempts that various parts of the organization were using to organize their content, put it in a single location for those particular user base that BI team was serving, and that was causing some major issues, some major challenges. Obviously, it goes without saying, if you have 30 different locations that you might have to go to for analytics, you don't have a single source of truth, right? You've got this hugely disparate problem, but but further beyond that, there was just a problem around consistency for metadata management and certification, things of that nature. You know, there were some groups that would do a really great job in their WordPress sites. They would include documentation and change logs, and your users could come in and they would know, you know, who's the owner of something and how did this particular analytic change over time, and so forth. While other sites, other groups just, you know, put up everything on their site and had people go in there. So it was inconsistent, and they were getting a lot of complaints from various parts of the organization saying that, you know, it's really hard to figure out, you know, where a particular report is, what does it really mean, what does this, you know, metric mean in a particular report, and how do I know what I can trust and what is something that, you know, was maybe good 6 months ago but is obsolete now and is no longer relevant. And then finally, the other big challenge that they were facing was around discoverability. So they were finding that time and time again, you know, content would actually be out there that was useful to a particular user, but the user wouldn't find it because they weren't granted access to that content in the security model, right? And that obviously you need a security model, but there was no mechanism whereby users could go in and say, how do I find, I want to search for something, and then if I don't have access to it, I want to be able to request access. And instead, they would not find it, and then they would go off and something duplicative often would be created for that same purpose. So, you know, these are very serious challenges. And what they did is they went through a concerted effort to put together a single centralized portal where all of their certified content across the enterprise can be accessed through basically a single pane of glass, right? One unified interface. And that's very important because it allows for there to be a unified single organizational structure for all the content. Now, obviously, in an organization this size, you can't do this with a single BI team managing, curating, building out that content. That's impossible, right? It's far too large, far too distributed of a problem. So they came up with a hub and spoke model where there was a center of excellence, a centralized team that established the standards that said, you know, here is the general, here's the master hierarchy of all the different categories. Here are the standards as far as what kind of documentation you need to have. Here's what constitutes what's something being certified, what it means and what's required to be able to put something up there to be certified. And then they brought on one team at a time. They onboarded various business units, the IT groups that were supporting those groups. And those BI teams were responsible for curating and publishing the content to the portal, making sure that the documentation was there, making sure that all the standards were adhered. But in this kind of very decentralized model, yet with some central standardization and control, they were able to tackle this what would otherwise be a really daunting problem. And then finally they added a discoverability layer. So they said, okay, you know, everything in the portal requires that the user be able to go in and, you know, they're only going to show them, of course, what they have access to directly in terms of being able to click through to see it. But if a user searches for something and they don't have access to it, we're going to sort of show them, let them know that something exists, and then allow them to be able to request access to it. That request then goes to the owner of that content, who can then determine whether they want to be, they should be authorized to see it or not. And so they enabled the sort of global discoverability layer that enabled a tighter connection with the single source of truth. So there are fundamental sort of the things they were able to achieve were that they achieved this unified governance level. So it's across the enterprise, across all the different teams. As each team was brought on board, that the portal increased until eventually span the entire enterprise. And that standardized documentation meant that every user knew what they could count on. They knew what was certified. And even most importantly, when you think about certification, to notice you can trust something as truth, it's not enough to know that it is certified. You actually need to know who certified it and when it was certified, right? So generating that accountability, that idea that I know, okay, this is the analyst or the business leader who certified that this data is correct. If I see a problem, that's who I ask. If I don't believe that the definition of something should be changed, here's who I need to go to request that change be made or to suggest that something be changed. So that you know, thinking of that certification as an organic ongoing process, as a gardening process, was very powerful for them, and they were able to really make that a part of the ongoing operation of the business. So a second company here where we're going to use the use case was a Fortune 400 software company. And they had a different challenge. They have multiple BI tools. I think in this particular case, there were Tableau, Power BI, MicroStrategy, and they were looking at their engagement across this BI tools. And they were realizing that, there were lots of things that were being created to be able to give people access, these things that people could use as a source of truth, but they were getting underutilized. They were getting very little usage. Sometimes, a few months would be spent by an analyst really creating something that was very thorough and comprehensive. And then 3 or 4 or 5 months later, that you look at usage in that and they'd find that only 10, 20% of the user community that was intended to use that was actively using that content. And, that's obviously a major challenge and a problem, and that there's lots of effort going into building these great analytics that could be useful to the business, but in fact they're not getting utilized. And so they went out and they surveyed the community. They did interviews. They looked to see why is that happening. What's causing this underlying lack of usage in these highly valuable visualizations. And they found out that essentially for their users the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. When the users were telling them, look, when I go in, I have just a few minutes a day that I can spend on analytics. By the time I search around and I find a dashboard, and then if I have to get to that dashboard, then I'm going to go and have to set my filter values to find my exact, the particular thing that's of interest. I've spent so much time, and the chances are that I'm not seeing anything necessarily interesting. So I'm not going to do it, So they found that was the problem, right? There was just not good ROI for their users on time investment in terms of the value that they were getting, and therefore they weren't going to these and leveraging the single source of truth that they'd created. So what did they do about that? Well, they changed the model so that rather than just making these analytics available to their users, they went to a much more of a push model. Well, sure, you could still go to a portal or go directly to those dashboards and access them, but they went through and identified for each group what are the essential KPIs, the essential dashboards and reports that audience needs to consume on a regular basis, and then set up systems such that they could distribute that to each stakeholder, oftentimes pre-filtered, so that that user had not just that dashboard, but that dashboard set with the filters that are most relevant to them. So now every day, users come in, they see in their email that the 10 dashboards that they should be looking at. They quickly flip through those. If there's something that raises an eyebrow, geez, there's something going on here, they click on it, and then they go to do further investigation live in the dashboard. But they're accessing that source of truth. It's not disconnected for them. And then additionally, they put in some critical alerts in place. So oftentimes you may have a dashboard, and the dashboard may have 3 or 4 or 5 different filters, and to find something useful, you got to go trolling through those filter values and switching them around, and then maybe the top line number is fine, but below at some combination of filters there's an issue. So this particular organization implemented some smart alerting such that they could push to their users a dashboard when it has something interesting to say, when there's an anomaly in the data, and that was very key, and that also helped them just generate a high level of engagement. So the end result was they went from a scenario where people were seldom looking at some of these key analytics to a scenario where they were looking at them every day because they were just coming in an email. It was taking 30 seconds to a minute to look at. And then they were driving users to the analytic that had something very useful when there was action to be taken. And they took out that whole searching process, and they took out the trial and error process of going through and finding, oh no, wait, this is not the right dashboard. This is an obsolete one. Where's the one that I used 2 weeks ago that is useful? That whole thing was gone because the most critical content was being pushed to the users, and they knew what they could trust and what they could use. So the third example that I want to cover is a pharmaceutical company. And so if those of you on the call that are in a pharmaceutical industry or know much about pharmaceuticals know that drug makers really rely on third-party providers to be able to collect information about their sales as compared to their competitors' sales. So, for example, if you've got a blockbuster drug that's a cancer drug, you've got reps that's calling on a physician, and that physician is prescribing that medication, and so one of the things that you're counting on is understanding how much is that physician prescribing your medication as opposed to your competitors, and oftentimes, in fact, usually your reps are compensated directly based on the market share that they generated. How good of a job did they do educating the doctors in their territory on the drugs that your company is selling and the benefits of those drugs, so that those get prescribed by the physician. So, and then this data is collected from from IMS, various different groups, IQVIA, various groups like that. So this particular pharmaceutical company had this challenge. They were collecting this data from a third-party source, and then they were, collating and delivering it to their end users, to the reps, so that each rep knew exactly what was going on in their territory. Well, every once in a while, there would be a problem in the data. Perhaps the third-party collector of data missed a location, or somebody didn't report it, or there was some other data quality or anomaly. And that would cause a given rep to see data that said, oh, we're way below where we need to be for market share. I'm losing market share in these accounts. And they would get compensated based on that. So, if you think about single source of truth, there is nothing that matters more to end users than the numbers that they're being used to determine the pay that they take at the end of the week. And so this was causing a huge problem, because they would realize, a month, sometimes 2 months later, that this data issue occurred when the third-party vendor corrected it. But by then, the damage had been done. The rep had been improperly compensated, and just even a small number of these kinds of issues, and even though the majority of the reporting was correct, but even a small number of data quality issues just generated a huge level of distrust, where the pharma reps basically said, we don't trust the data at all. And that was leading to both low morale among the sales reps, as well as a poor relationship between the BI team and the sales reps, because the BI team felt like, the BI team felt like they're doing the best they can, but the sales reps felt like, well, we're not really getting data, and they're blaming the BI organization for that. So what did they do? Well, they implemented statistical analysis around their data. So they really said, okay, now we know that we can't control what's coming from this third-party source. But instead of just taking the data and sending it onto the reps and reports, we're going to institute another check in between. Well, we're going to do statistical analysis on the data, and we're going to identify where the anomalies are. Where is it that maybe there's an unusual volatility relative to what was there in the past few months, or something all of a sudden went to zero, where before there was, for a particular prescriber, there was a high number, or any number of scenarios such as that. So both a set of preset rules, as well as just basic anomaly detection statistical analysis. And they generated out of that a set of exceptions. And then they would follow up, before they even released the data to the reps, they'd follow up with a third party to say, hey, we've noticed this. Could these be data issues? And what that allowed them to do is, now when the data went to the reps, they could pre-annotate, pre-identify to those reps that, in fact, these particular cases look like they could be data quality issues. So just heads up. This other thing looks legit. So, you look like you've really got an issue with this particular this part of your territory. You might want to do something about that. And that fundamentally changed things in two ways. First of all, obviously the data quality that was there was much higher, and the reps felt like they could trust more of what they received, because there was this pre-qualification that was coming from the BI team telling them what was going on. So that raised morale. But also, very importantly, it increased the relationship between the quality of the relationship between the BI team and the sales reps, because now the sales reps felt like, okay, these BI analysts are are doing their best to really help us, and they're being proactive in investigating the issues. And they're telling me when something in a number is not truthful. They're telling me that it's not truthful. I don't have to discover this on my own and then complain to them. And so just that was a major transformation in the way that group functioned. Then a final example is that I wanted to cover is the clinical trials company. Now, I think all of us on this call have had our business turned upside down by COVID, right? There's things, the processes that are different, there are metrics that are different, how we measure the business, all those things have changed, right? They've necessarily changed due to the impact of COVID. Well, that's especially true for a company like this that does clinical trials. So this particular organization does trials for pretty much all the major pharmaceutical companies globally, and they rely on being able to go to physicians' offices, to administer the trials, to meet with patients that are in the trials, to collect feedback, to do that across multiple geographies and pull it all together. And with COVID, all of that turned upside down. There were some places where you couldn't get anybody into physician's office unless it was an emergency. Other places, there were all kinds of rules about who could be in the office, how information could be captured. So they had to really rethink and relook at how their trials were being operated and figure out creatively, based on what was allowed and what was not allowed across the different geographies, what actions could be taken to keep these critical trials still moving forward, so that the drug pipelining was not hampered. And to do that, they needed to make sure that everybody was laser focused on the key KPIs around the clinical trial process, and avoid the fact that people getting numbers in different places, but rather just say, here's the single source of truth, here's where you get your numbers, and if you need to get to detail, here's where you get to detail. So demystify that whole process for their users. What do they do? Well, they came up with this operational metrics dashboard concept, where they pulled all of the key metrics around the trial process. These metrics came from various different data sources. Some came from databases, some came from Cognos reports or other types of reports that they had from various sources, and they bubbled them up into a single pane of glass where a user could come in and at a glance see all their metrics. And they, not only that, but they could see it at the level of granularity that was relevant for them. So the idea is that, if I'm overseeing all the clinical trials for a country, I see my country level metrics. If I'm responsible for a particular trial within that country, I'm seeing the trial data for that country. And then from there, I have stoplighting, so I know, if something's in the red, I need to do something about it. If it's green, I'll have to worry about it. So I can kind of immediately see which metrics are trending in the wrong direction. And most importantly, I can click on any of those metrics and I can be taken to a detailed visualization, so a report that gives me the detail behind that and lets me analyze what's going on. So again, that single source of truth, no longer a problem. Their users can know they can trust this. They don't need to hunt for reports. They don't need to figure out which version of this report has the right answer. They don't need to look through 3 or 4 or 5 different dashboards to get to their KPIs. The KPIs come first. They go from the top level with one click away. They're going to the detail, and then they're doing their analysis. And that's change, that reorganization of their existing content, structuring, filtering, giving people the things that they really need to focus on first, was a paradigm shift that allowed them to be very agile through this transition period that they had to go through with COVID. And that helped, increase trust in their BI team. The BI team knew that increased trust in the users. The users knew which content they could work with, and then they could connect through to the content that was relevant very quickly. Okay, so to wrap up, before we get into Q&A, just wanted to summarize the themes that we've seen. You've seen them in the items I've presented here, but that we've also seen it across dozens of other customers that are trying to struggle with the single source of truth problem. So first of all, quality data, as Bill mentioned, is critical. It is, it's a pillar that you must have in place. However, you're never going to be 100% correct 100% of the time. That's not achievable. So it's absolutely critical that you be able to communicate to users proactively when a data source is not updated, when a data source does not have correct data because of data quality issues. Being proactive makes a difference between a data quality issue being an opportunity to improve the relationship with your stakeholders or an opportunity to make that relationship worse because they're finding something and letting you know of a problem. Second, organizing all your content in a way that people understand what it is that where it is the data, how do they find it, and making it discoverable so that people can easily find things that they don't necessarily have access to, but they can request permission to connect with. Third item, certification and trust. And it's not, again, not enough to just know what's certified, but you've got to know who can you go to if you have a question about this content and who's accountable for making sure that it's always accurate. The fourth key point, you need to be able to make sure you have focused people's attention via anomaly and exception detection. So people are too busy to go and visit all the dashboards that are out there. You need to focus their attention on the right dashboard by pushing content to them in such a way that they know that something's going on here. I need to take a look. And then finally, distribution. So given that people only, many organizations, business users have a minute or two a day, that's it. That's all they can have to spend time on. Get those critical analytics that they absolutely need to spend time on and get them to look at it by pushing it to their email, to Slack, to wherever it is that they live. So with that, let me pass that back to Bill and then I'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I'll encourage everybody on the call who's listening in, you can enter your questions at will. Just use the Q&A box. And in the meantime, let's see. I'll tell you what, Marius, maybe what we can do for this short Q&A part, maybe stop sharing your screen, and what we'll be able to do then is everyone will be able to see us as we talk.
Okay, got it.
Plainly. So a couple questions to get it started while the audience is continuing to come in. One thing I'm curious about related to Deere is I did hear some of the comments that lean towards you're focusing not just on the data itself, but also on the usage of that data. Was that something that was fully understood, expected, and planned up front, or did you end up getting there over time as you realized that as the data became available and then you saw that there were issues with the usage of that data on the back end? Just curious.
I think a mix of what you said, that we had ideas originally of how we could use the data and how it could help our stakeholders. But, until you get in and realize the pros and cons of, going towards a single source of truth and how it'll be used, you don't really know until you are able to deliver some of these insights. So it kind of went both ways,
And following up on that, did you start as you went down this? Was it an effort that was largely grassroots? The I team, the analytics organization, business team all tried to work together and said we want to do this, or did it require an upfront executive mandate where you were forced to do it? It sounded like you had a pretty collegial atmosphere compared to some from what you were commenting on.
There was a lot of collaboration, and of course, some of the direction did come from leadership as well. But the thing about our leadership, they really value data and technology and can see how important our group was to the organization. And so we were able to kind of have some of that framework getting started. But then as we continued to deliver and work really closely with our IT product teams, and just to see how much that's benefiting the organization, it continues to build momentum.
Marius, one for you. You mentioned a really interesting point about not just certifying data, but actually saying who, along with when it was certified. And one big advantage I see to that would be somebody leaves the company, and even to the extent that some of the knowledge they had disappears with them, at least having that documented, you can go back and go, oh gosh, now that Bill's gone, here are the 10, 20, whatever it is, different places where Bill was the responsible certifier. So obviously you have to reassign those, but you also then need to, validate that people have it. How have you seen people handle that who component of that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and that's right. So we've seen, the process that you described. So whenever somebody kind of leaves the team, you reassign all those certification ownership, and then that new party has to come back in and certify, and then and owns it. But we've also seen scenarios where data doesn't live in a certified state forever. So this is actually very common in the banking industry, right? You have your financials that you're maybe publishing at the end of the month that you're reporting up to the board. And so the metrics that show that financial number is certified for last month, but then as it gets to the beginning, getting close to the end of the next month, you've got the next period in there. It's no longer certified until various groups have gone in. Sometimes it's not just one person, but it's a whole group of folks that have to be able to certify. And so we've seen people have very simple certification workflows, where it's just a simple single layer certification one time, and then come back to it only if it needs to be decertified, all the way to fairly complex workflows where it requires multiple people to sign off to get certified, to scenarios where it's multiple people and with a automated decertification once a quarter or once a month, and then it has to get recertified. It all depends on how how strict the compliance requirements are, regulatory requirements, and what the nature of the data is. But I think the process is important, and there's various toolkits available to manage that process. But I think the most important thing is to understand what are the levels of certification that are required around the data, and then design a process that will allow you to achieve that.
I thought the one word you used there, I like the automated decertification, right? At some point, an expiration date effectively. Also, similar to a person leaving, all of a sudden, hey, no one's even looked at this in 3 months, or at least we can't prove they did. Let's get someone to do it. Here's one from the audience. It came in around one of your examples. It says, what happens when there's a non-certified report or some type of bespoke report that someone requires that it may not be in use enough or long enough to warrant all the certification? How do you handle those? What do you do?
So what we found our customers, at least with us, what they typically do is they will allow an area of the portal to contain. Well, there's two strategies to do it. One is to make sure that everything is tagged clearly, whether it's certified or not, in your portal. And if you do that, then non-certified content can live right side by side with certified content, and users know when they're looking at it, hey, this is not something I necessarily can trust, but it's something that's being built. So that's one approach that's used. In other scenarios, people want to keep certain areas of their portal pristine and not have any non-certified content in there to avoid even the chance of there being any confusion, in which case then you simply designate certain other areas for places where there's these tier 2 objects. And as long as you have the facility for users to self-service and combine the content they wish to see together, so they can say, here's the 3 objects that I look at all the time that are certified, but I know that this thing is still under development, but it's useful to me, I want to reference that, let me bring that in as well. You can achieve that hybrid model as well.
Michael, I think this question might be a good one to start with you. It was about how do you set the expectations around the cost and time to implement a robust system like we've been talking about on this call today?
So what we've done in our early stages of this process is we've dedicated one of our resources and it acts as a project for him. And he may be working on 4 or 5 projects at one time, but one of these is looking into and testing it out. And so he works closely with a data catalyst, that a specific area we're working with to test this out. And they are calculating, what's the value of this? How long does it take? How fast can we learn? And as we've seen, as they add reports to this repository or other objects, we see that the pace is increasing, and we can estimate that going forward, this is about how much resources or what % of resources would be needed to build it out completely or just more advanced.
And then you had also mentioned, someone put in a question, you had mentioned at one point in your slides and discussion about old habits die hard. Did you have 1 or 2 examples beyond what you spoke about that you could give about an old habit that got in your way as you went through this process?
Yeah, of course. And a stakeholder might ask about um, maybe it's, I mentioned they have all the links set up and they go to those links every time, or they may say, here's a report that we've used for years and we're using it this way, but then our group may have just developed one that covers, one report might cover 3 different questions that are being asked. And we just work closely with the stakeholder to point them in the direction of, yes, you can get your answer from this particular spot in this new report. And so that's where the role of the catalyst comes in to help with that transition into using new technologies and new ways of thinking. And what we found is a lot of times it opens the eyes of our stakeholders in such a positive way that they see possibilities to like their world and that area of the business that they hadn't been possible yet. And it's just that communication piece is so key.
I'll tell you what, we're coming up towards the top of the hour. Maybe just a real quick 30 seconds. We'll do you first, Marius, then you, Michael, and then we'll turn it over to Haley to close it out. Just any last thoughts or last pieces of advice you might have for about 30 seconds. Marius, you first.
Yeah, I think sort of just take, as Bill, you covered in your presentation, I think it's very important to take a holistic view here, to think about more than just the data, to think about the presentation layer and look at the journey that your business community is going through and consuming the data, and then come up with a strategy around generating that single source of truth that fits that journey, that addresses the obstacles that they're facing on a day-to-day basis in a very proactive, practical, and incremental way.
So for me, real quick, Marius touched on this, and Bill, you did as well. Is stick to your process. You're going to establish a process early, and for us, it was really working closely with our catalysts and knowing that they own that source of area of responsibility within their specific part of the business. Design an area around that team, and that helps you organize reports. It helps they work closely with the stakeholders, and if that's working for you, it's worked for us, then stick to that process and then build off of that from there. And never be afraid, because we say this all the time, communicate. It's just so important to have that communication with stakeholders and what we're trying to transition to and what's our goals. Always be looking towards your goals the next, maybe in 3 to 5 years, and developing those roadmaps are really important.
All right, well, I'll wrap up here real quick and just thank both of you for your participation and thank everyone who came. Haley, I'll turn it back to you. I know you have a couple of closing words you'd like to say before we sign off.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. And thank you, Marius and Michael and everyone else that's joined us here today. So as I mentioned earlier, just in case you did miss it, we have recorded this. We will be sharing the recording with you. So you will find that in your inbox tomorrow, so you can watch it on demand and share it with your team. So if you did want to know a little bit more about IIA and the services that we provide, you can head over to our website, which is iianalytics.com/services. And with all of that said, I just wanted to say thank you again and have a great day, everyone.